I mentioned before my own struggle with reconciling standard secular history with biblical history.
And I wrestled with this also. Most everyone does.
And because there's such a discrepancy, and it's got a long age, longer timeline. And in the secular one, we have things like the pyramids being built before the biblical account.
Yeah, we've been asked this before. We've made videos on this. We have articles on this on creation.com. If you just take standard Egyptian history, the date of the building of the pyramids is prior to the biblical year of the flood. That's a massive problem because it just can't be true for a couple of reasons. One, the pyramids are built out of limestone, and the limestone should be flood-deposited rocks.
Okay, explain that.
Noah's flood is that which produced the fossil record. If the Earth's only thousands of years old, we don't have millions of years for the fossil record. And the only thing in there that's going to make a fossil record is a giant watery catastrophe that lays down the sandstones and the mudstones and the limestones and things like that. And so the fossil record, the rock record, is by and large, except for the creation rocks and things that have happened since the flood, the last 4,500 years, the bulk of the fossil record is flood-deposited rocks. Well, the pyramids are carved out of that limestone. So they can't have been built before the flood if the rocks come from the flood. But not only that, limestone's not a dense rock. It's not that much heavier than water. It's maybe 2.5 times heavier than water. So if you...
Which would have made it a really good building material. If you've got to heft all of that weighty rock, it helps to have a light rock.
Yes, the biggest problems with the pyramids are the granite blocks that they had to hoist up high. The limestone blocks are a lot less dense, a lot easier to handle. But you have all these limestone blocks that don't weigh relatively that much underwater. They're not cemented together. So you have a stack of loose rocks, and it's a huge, huge surface area. What happens if it's underwater and you haven't had the slightest little current?
They're going toppling.
The whole thing's going to come toppling down. So they can't survive the flood. They have to be built out of flood rocks. They have to be post-flood. But the date for Egypt, for the things, is before the biblical date of the flood. Our answer is all of Egyptian history. The further back you go in Egyptian history, the more you have to adjust the dates forward. The non-biblical archaeologists, they don't have a time problem. They have as much time as they want. They can relax the timeline however they want. And so things tend to be expanded artificially. But if you look at it, there's places, big old gaps in there that you can say, okay, that probably doesn't exist, or this intermediate period needs to be reduced, and all of Egyptian history comes forward in time. The other funny thing about ancient time, consider that, most archaeologists would estimate, I don't know, maybe there's 1 million people in the world for, 10,000 years, 100,000 years. Well, if the average lifespan's 30 years or so, 40 years maybe in the old times, that's like 1 million dead bodies every 30 years. That's a lot of dead bodies. If you expand that to 10,000, 20, 30,000 years, there's billions of bodies. Where are the graves? Where are the towns? Where are the campsites? Where are the little villages that got raided by another tribe and got wiped out? We're missing all of this archaeology as if the time really isn't there. And so Egyptian history has been artificially expanded. Chinese history has been artificially expanded. So all these histories that supposedly predate the Bible can be easily crunched together or crunched forward in time when you realize the evidence for the time really isn't there. Except for carbon dating, which, as I said earlier, looks like it gets expanded the closer to the flood you get. So all these old carbon dates that they get, well, they should be brought forward in time also.
Just give us a brief tutorial on carbon dating.
All right. Well, I would point people to my article on creation.com, How Carbon Dating Works.
Or doesn't work?
Well, no, it works very well up to about the time of Christ.
Okay.
You can, like when they found Richard III under a parking lot in England, they carbon dated him and it's like, oh, that's Richard III. Once they did a proper historical model of what he thought he should eat versus the peasants, because peasants eat chickpeas and the king would eat a lot of beef. And that actually affects your carbon date. So you have to have a historical model. It's crazy complicated, but it does work. But when you get back to, I don't know, about 500 BC, you run into something called the Hallstatt disaster, named after a site in Europe. But this is the time of the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire. All the carbon dates give you the same number.
That can't be.
The calibration curve has a flat spot in it. And so all these centuries of time give you about the same carbon answer. So you can't use carbon dating for that time period. And when you go as far back as maybe the Battle of Jericho in the Bible, we know biblically when that happened, but the carbon date is about 150 years too early because you're starting to get back closer to the flood, and that carbon date is too old. And so anything before that, it should be magnified as you get closer to the flood, because the pre-flood world would not have had much carbon-14 in it. Why
not?
Because we had a stronger magnetic field, because carbon-14 builds up in the upper atmosphere from cosmic rays. That's how it's manufactured. It has a very short half-life, so it has to be constantly regenerated. And we started with the world with no carbon-14. There's not going to be much, I'm assuming, there's not going to be much carbon-14 in the pre-flood world. It's going to build up to today's equilibrium level. So when we do find an old campfire somewhere along the banks of the Nile in Egypt, and say, oh, let's carbon date this. Oh, this is 52,000 BC. No, it's not. It's probably 3,000 BC. It's much earlier than what they're assuming. And so those sorts of influences, the fact that they don't have a hard limit for the flood and they have carbon dating, allows the secular Egyptologists and Chineseologists and Europeanologists to expand their time frames way beyond where they should be.
If you've enjoyed watching this, you're going to want to check out Creation Magazine. You can sign up for it with a link in the description for this video, and we will send you a free gift.